They pushed him into a frozen forest to catalogue what they said was a dead man's estate. But what Thorne Caldwell found beneath that cabin floor wasn't just artifacts. It was $300 million worth of stolen history, a smuggling ring that spanned continents, and the truth about why his entire life had been destroyed 5 years ago. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Thorne Caldwell kept his hands wrapped around the chipped mug anyway, staring at the eviction notice taped to his apartment door. 30 days. That's all he had left before everything he owned would be sitting on a Billings, Montana sidewalk in cardboard boxes that still smelled like his old life. He was 38 years old, a former geological surveyor who once commanded six-figure contracts and respect in rooms that mattered. Now he fixed leaking faucets for $75 a pop and pretended not to see the pity in his landlord's eyes when rent came up short again. The divorce papers had been finalized 8 months ago. Sable kept the house, the good furniture, and what remained of his reputation. He kept the debt, the shame, and a studio apartment that leaked when it rained. Fair trade, he supposed, for being the man who'd torpedoed his own career by telling the truth. 5 years ago, Thorne had been the lead surveyor for Hendricks Geological Services, a massive firm that did site assessments for mining operations across the western United States. He'd loved that job. Loved the fieldwork, the precision, the way numbers and soil samples could tell stories no one else could read. Until he found something that wasn't supposed to be found. Deep in the Bitterroot Range, while surveying a proposed copper mine site, Thorne discovered evidence of illegal dumping. Toxic waste buried in violation of every federal regulation that existed. When he reported it, when he documented it with photographs and soil samples and coordinates that couldn't be argued with, he thought he was doing his job. Instead, he learned what happens when you embarrass powerful men. Marlo Hendricks, the company's founder and CEO, was a man whose name opened doors and closed mouths. Billionaire, philanthropist, collector of rare things, and apparently someone willing to bury evidence along with the waste. The company turned on Thorne overnight. Suddenly, his data was questioned. His methodology was flawed. Whispers started that he'd fabricated findings to cover his own mistakes on another project. Within 6 months, he was unemployed, unemployable, and watching his marriage crumble under the weight of legal bills and shame. Marlo Hendricks had died 6 months ago. Heart attack in his sleep, the papers said. Thorne had read the obituary twice, felt nothing, and moved on. Dead men couldn't be held accountable anyway, but apparently dead men could still reach out from the grave. The email had arrived 3 days ago, plain text, professional tone, from a law firm Thorne had never heard of, Vesper and Associates, Estate Services. We represent the estate of Marlo Hendricks. We understand you have specialized knowledge in geological survey and artifact assessment. We have a unique opportunity that requires immediate attention. Compensation is $15,000 for 2 weeks of work. Reply if interested. $15,000. Thorne had stared at that number until his vision blurred. $15,000 would cover the back rent, the eviction, maybe even get him a decent used truck so he could stop borrowing his neighbor's pickup for jobs. It was more money than he'd seen in one place since the divorce. He'd replied within an hour. The response came the next morning, terse and strange. Remote location, wilderness cabin, estate inventory and assessment. Must be available immediately. Must commit to full 2 weeks on site. Transportation provided, all expenses covered. Send confirmation. Something about it felt wrong. Thorne had learned to trust that feeling, that little whisper in the back of his mind that said, slow down, look closer, ask questions. But desperation has a way of drowning out whispers. He sent confirmation. Now, 72 hours later, he stood in the parking lot of a rest stop 40 miles outside of Missoula, a duffel bag at his feet and winter coming down from the mountains like a promise of suffering. The sky was the color of old bruises, and the wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't even there. A black Suburban pulled up exactly on time. The driver didn't get out, didn't wave, just sat behind tinted windows with the engine running. Thorne grabbed his bag and walked over. When he opened the passenger door, cold air and silence spilled out. The driver was maybe 50, weathered face, grey stubble, eyes that looked past Thorne rather than at him. "Thorne Caldwell?" the man asked. "That's me." "Colt, I'm your ride. Put your bag in the back." No handshake, no small talk. Thorne loaded his duffel and climbed into the passenger seat. The Suburban was immaculate, leather interior, expensive. Not the kind of vehicle he'd expect for a simple estate job. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. Thorne tried a few conversation starters, asked about the weather, the route, how long Colt had worked for the firm. Every question hit a wall of one-word answers or grunts. Finally, Thorne gave up and watched Montana scroll past the window. They left the highway after an hour, turned onto a 2-lane county road that hadn't seen a plow in days. Snow was already falling, light but steady, the kind that meant business was coming. "Storm's supposed to hit tonight," Thorne said. Colt nodded. "How far is this place?" "Far." Another hour passed. The county road became a forestry road. The forestry road became something that barely qualified as a road at all, just 2 ruts through the trees where someone had driven enough times to kill the vegetation. Thorne checked his phone. No signal. Hadn't had one for the last 40 minutes. "We lose cell service out here?" he asked. "Yep." "Is there a landline at the cabin?" "Nope." Thorne felt the first real spike of unease. "So if there's an emergency—" "Don't have emergencies," Colt said. "You're there for 2 weeks. You do the job. I come back. Simple." "What if the storm's bad?" "Then you wait it out." The trees pressed closer now, dense pine and spruce heavy with snow. The light was fading fast, that strange purple-grey twilight that happens in winter when the sun gives up early. Thorne could see maybe 30 feet into the forest on either side. Beyond that, just shadows and white silence. They drove for another 40 minutes. Thorne had lost all sense of direction. Every tree looked the same. Every turn felt random. He understood suddenly, with cold clarity, that he had no idea how to get back to civilization. He was completely dependent on Colt, on this silent stranger who seemed determined to say as little as possible. "How much further?" Thorne asked. "Almost there." 15 minutes later, the Suburban slowed. Ahead, barely visible through the falling snow, Thorne saw a structure. Not a cabin, a house. Substantial, 2 stories, built from heavy logs that had weathered to silver grey. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. Light glowed in the windows, warm and welcoming against the gathering dark. Colt pulled up to the front porch and killed the engine. "This is it," he said. Thorne stared at the house. It was beautiful in a rough, frontier way, the kind of place that cost serious money to build this far from anywhere, the kind of place that suggested wealth, preparation, permanence. "Whose estate is this?" Thorne asked. "You know whose." Thorne turned to Colt. "Marlo Hendricks owned this?" Colt didn't answer. He got out, walked to the back, and pulled out Thorne's duffel. He carried it to the porch, set it down, and walked back to the Suburban. "Wait," Thorne said, climbing out. "You're leaving?" "Job's done. Got you here." "But the storm—" "You'll be fine. Place is stocked. Generators full. Firewood stacked. Everything you need is inside." "When are you coming back?" 2 weeks. Colt climbed into the driver's seat. "What if I need to leave early?" Colt looked at him for the first time with something like expression. It might have been pity. "You signed the contract. 2 weeks. You leave early, you don't get paid." "But—" The Suburban's engine roared to life. Colt rolled up his window and turned the vehicle around in a smooth arc. Within 30 seconds, the tail lights had disappeared into the swirling snow, and Thorn was alone. He stood in the falling snow, watching the darkness swallow the last trace of his ride out. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no planes, no distant voices or machinery, just wind through pine branches and the soft whisper of snow hitting snow. Thorn picked up his duffel and climbed the porch steps. The wood was solid, well-maintained. Someone had cared for this place. Recently. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped into warmth. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Vaulted ceilings with exposed beams, a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, fire already burning low. Leather furniture, expensive rugs, walls lined with bookshelves. It looked like a magazine spread for mountain luxury living. "Hello?" Thorn called out. His voice echoed and died. Nobody answered. He set his duffel down and explored. The kitchen was fully stocked, canned goods, dry goods, freezer full of meat, fresh vegetables in the refrigerator that couldn't have been there long. Bread on the counter, soft to the touch. Someone had been here recently, today maybe. Upstairs he found 3 bedrooms, all made up with clean linens. The master bedroom had a king bed and windows that looked out over the forest. In the fading light, he could see the snow falling heavier now, big flakes that meant the storm was settling in. Back downstairs, he found a study. Desk, filing cabinets, computer that looked brand new. On the desk, a folder with his name on it. Thorn opened it. Inside, a typed letter on law firm letterhead. "Mr. Caldwell, thank you for accepting this assignment. Your task is to conduct a complete inventory and assessment of the items stored on this property. You will find a detailed checklist and documentation requirements in the attached materials. Take your time. Be thorough. Compensation will be provided upon completion and submission of your final report. All necessary equipment and supplies have been provided. Vesper and Associates." Beneath the letter, a thick stack of inventory sheets, empty, waiting to be filled out. Thorn flipped through them. They were organized by category: geological samples, mineral specimens, historical artifacts, documents, artwork, furniture, personal effects. It was extensive, professional, weird. He was a geological surveyor, not an estate appraiser. Why would they hire him for this? He kept exploring. Found a locked door off the kitchen. Heavy, solid, with a commercial-grade deadbolt that seemed wildly out of place in a vacation cabin. He tried the handle. Locked tight. A basement, probably. Storage. That's where the estate items must be. But where was the key? Thorn searched the obvious places. Drawer by the door. Hooks on the wall. Nothing. The key wasn't where it should be. He made a mental note to look more thoroughly tomorrow and continued his exploration. Found a mudroom with expensive winter gear in his size. Boots, parka, gloves. Someone had prepared for his arrival with unsettling precision. By the time he'd finished exploring, full dark had fallen outside. The wind had picked up, rattling windows, making the house creak in its bones. The fire had burned down to coals. Thorn added wood, watched the flames catch and climb. He made himself dinner from the supplies, pasta and jarred sauce, mechanical and tasteless. His mind kept circling back to questions. Why had Marlo Hendricks owned a cabin this remote? Why had the firm hired him specifically? Why the locked basement? Why did everything about this feel staged? He ate standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the storm. The snow was really coming down now, wind-driven and horizontal. Drifts were already forming against the porch railing. By morning the roads would be impassable. He was trapped here whether he liked it or not. After dinner, he went through the filing cabinets in the study. Most were empty. A few contained mundane papers, property tax records, utility bills, maintenance receipts. Nothing interesting. Nothing that explained why he was here. One drawer was locked. Thorn stared at it. 2 locked doors in one house. That wasn't accident. That was intentional. He tried to force it with a letter opener. No luck. The lock was solid. Exhaustion hit him suddenly. The weight of the long day, the stress, the strangeness. He needed sleep. Tomorrow he could search more thoroughly, find the keys, figure out what was going on. He went upstairs to the master bedroom, turned on the lamp, and pulled out his phone out of habit. Still no signal. He was completely cut off. Thorne undressed and crawled under the heavy quilts. The bed was comfortable. The room was warm. Outside, the storm howled and threw snow against the windows like handfuls of rice. He closed his eyes. Sleep came fast, but it didn't last. Something woke him, a sound, wrong and out of place. Thorne lay in the darkness, heart pounding, listening. The house creaked in the wind. Branches scraped against the roof. Normal sounds, but underneath them, something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from downstairs. He sat up, pulse racing. He was alone. He was supposed to be alone. Colt had driven away hours ago. The footsteps moved through the house, not trying to be quiet, not rushing, just walking, like someone familiar with the space. Thorne eased out of bed, grabbed his phone for the flashlight, and moved to the bedroom door. He opened it slowly, peered into the dark hallway. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. He stood there, barely breathing, listening with every fiber of his being. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling, old wood contracting in the cold. Then he heard it again. Downstairs, in the kitchen, the sound of the locked door opening. Thorne's blood turned to ice. He crept to the top of the stairs, staying in shadow, and looked down. From his angle he could see part of the kitchen. A light flickered, dim and yellow. A flashlight. Someone was down there. He watched, frozen, as a shadow moved across the wall. Tall, human. Definitely human. Then the basement door closed. The light disappeared. Silence returned. Thorne waited 5 full minutes before moving. When he finally descended the stairs, every step felt like it might shatter the silence. He made it to the kitchen, reached for the light switch, and stopped. The basement door was closed, locked again, but on the floor in front of it, fresh snow, melting into small puddles. Someone had come in from outside, gone into the basement, and left again. Thorne rushed to the front door, threw it open. Wind and snow blasted into the house. He shone his phone light across the porch, down the steps. Footprints, recent, leading from the tree line to the house and away again, back into the darkness. He wasn't alone out here. Thorne slammed the door, locked it, and stood with his back against the wood. His hands were shaking. His breath came in short gasps. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He searched the house again, this time desperately. Looked for weapons, found a fire poker. Looked for the basement key, found nothing. Looked for a phone, a radio, any way to communicate with the outside world. Nothing. He was trapped in a remote cabin with no way out, no way to call for help, and someone was watching. Someone had keys. Someone was coming and going as they pleased. Thorne went back upstairs, pushed a dresser in front of the bedroom door, and sat on the bed with the fire poker across his lap. Outside, the storm raged on. Dawn came grey and hostile, light barely filtering through the heavy clouds and still falling snow. Thorne hadn't slept. He'd spent the night listening to every sound, jumping at every creak, waiting for footsteps that never came again. When there was enough light to see by, he moved the dresser and went downstairs. The house looked exactly as he'd left it. The basement door was still locked. The puddles of melted snow had dried. He might have convinced himself he'd imagined it, except for one thing. On the kitchen table, where nothing had been before, sat a small brass key. Thorne stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been there last night, he was certain. Someone had left it for him. Someone wanted him to open that basement door. He picked up the key. It was warm, like it had been in someone's pocket. Heavy, real. He walked to the basement door, heart hammering. This was a choice. He could leave the door locked. He could spend 2 weeks in the main house, make up an inventory report, take his 15,000 and leave. Pretend he'd never seen the footprints, never heard the sounds. Or he could put the key in the lock and find out why he was really here. Thorne thought about the eviction notice, about Sable's disappointed eyes, about 5 years of running from the consequences of telling the truth, about being broke and broken and barely surviving. He thought about Marlo Hendricks, the man who'd destroyed his life, the man who'd owned this cabin, the man who was dead but somehow still pulling strings. He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, well-oiled, like it had been used recently. The door opened. Beyond it, darkness and stairs, leading down into cold air that smelled like stone and earth and something else, something chemical, preservative. Thorne flicked on the light switch beside the door. Fluorescent bulbs hummed to life below, revealing industrial-grade stairs, metal and concrete, descending much farther than a normal basement should go. He took the first step down, then another. The temperature dropped with each step. By the time he reached the bottom, maybe 20 feet below the main floor, his breath was fogging in the air. What he saw stopped him cold. This wasn't a basement, it was a vault. The space stretched out before him, easily 3,000 square feet, with a ceiling height of 12 feet. Motion sensor lights clicked on in sections as he moved forward, revealing row after row of climate-controlled display cases. Inside the cases, objects, hundreds of them, thousands. Thorne walked forward in a daze. Stone tablets covered in ancient script, pottery painted with scenes from civilizations he couldn't name, jewelry that gleamed gold and precious stones, sculptures of jade and bronze and marble, weapons, tools, masks, textiles preserved behind glass. Each case had a small placard. He leaned close to read one. Mixtec Gold Pectoral, Oaxaca region, circa 1400 to 1500 AD. Acquired June 1997. His stomach turned. Acquired. Not purchased. Not donated. Acquired. He moved to the next case. Egyptian Ushabti figures, 18th dynasty. Acquired March 2003. Another. Greco-Roman marble relief, 2nd century AD. Acquired November 2008. Thorne walked faster now, his horror growing with each step. Everywhere he looked, priceless artifacts, museum-quality pieces, things that should have been in institutions, available for scholars, for the public, for the cultures they came from. Instead, they were here, hidden in an underground vault in the Montana wilderness, owned by a dead billionaire with a taste for collecting things that weren't his to collect. He found a section of Native American artifacts, sacred objects, burial goods, things that tribal nations had been searching for, fighting for, trying to repatriate for decades. He found a case of illuminated manuscripts, medieval, irreplaceable. He found coins, stamps, maps, scientific instruments, all carefully catalogued, all perfectly preserved, all stolen. At the far end of the vault, Thorne found a desk, modern, out of place among the antiquities. On it, a laptop computer. He opened it. It powered on immediately, no password required. The desktop had one folder, inventory. Inside, spreadsheets, detailed, professional, listing every single item in the vault with photographs, provenance, acquisition details, and estimated value. Thorne's hands shook as he scrolled through the files. The values were staggering. Individual pieces worth hundreds of thousands. Some worth millions. Added together, the collection was worth more than most museums' entire holdings. At the bottom of the main spreadsheet, a total. Estimated collection value, $312 million. Thorne sat back in the chair, the number burning in his vision. $312 million of stolen cultural heritage, hidden beneath a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and he'd been brought here to catalogue it. But why? Why him? He clicked on another folder. Acquisition records. Inside, documents, photographs, correspondence. A paper trail showing how Marlo Hendricks had built this collection over 30 years. Purchases from black market dealers, bribes to museum officials, theft disguised as archaeological salvage, connections to warlords and corrupt governments. Thorne felt sick. Then he found a subfolder. Insurance. Inside, video files. He clicked on the most recent one. Marlo Hendricks appeared on screen. He looked old, sick. This had been recorded recently, maybe weeks before his death. "If you're watching this," Hendricks said, his voice rough, "then I'm dead, and they've sent someone to deal with my collection." Thorne leaned closer. "I know what I did. I know what this makes me. I've lived with it for 30 years, and I'll die with it on my conscience." Hendricks coughed, took a labored breath. "But I won't let them have it. Won't let them profit from it. Vesper isn't a law firm. They're smugglers, partners. They helped me acquire half of what's down there. Now they want to move it, sell it, make themselves rich off my death." Thorne's blood ran cold. "So I set a trap. I brought in someone clean, someone who knows what it means to stand up to power, someone who lost everything for telling the truth." Hendricks looked directly into the camera. "If they sent you, Thorne Caldwell, it's because they think you're desperate enough to be controlled. Prove them wrong. Prove me right for choosing you." The video ended. Thorne sat in stunned silence. He'd been set up. Again. Marlo Hendricks had orchestrated this from beyond the grave, and Vesper, whoever they really were, had walked him right into it. But set up to do what? He clicked on the final folder. Instructions. Inside, a single document. It was addressed to him. Thorne clicked on the document. His name stared back at him from the top of the page in bold letters that felt like an accusation and an invitation all at once. "Mr. Caldwell, if you're reading this, you've found the vault. You've seen the collection. You've watched my confession. Now you have a choice to make." The document continued for several pages. Thorne read every word, his chest tightening with each paragraph. Hendricks laid it all out. How he'd started collecting in his 30s, convinced he was preserving history. How it became an addiction, a compulsion. How he'd partnered with Vesper, a network of smugglers and corrupt officials who could get anything for the right price. How he'd watched governments fall, museums burn, and indigenous peoples lose their sacred objects. All so he could own beauty that was never meant to be owned. But something had changed in Hendricks' final years. Guilt, maybe, fear of judgment, or just the clarity that comes when death starts breathing down your neck. He'd wanted to make it right, wanted to return everything. But Vesper wouldn't allow it. The collection was collateral, leverage, proof of crimes that could destroy powerful people. If Hendricks tried to go public, Vesper would bury him and everyone connected to him. So he'd devised another plan. He'd find someone Vesper would underestimate, someone desperate enough to need money, but honest enough to do the right thing when shown the truth. Someone with a history of standing up to power even when it cost them everything. He'd chosen Thorne. The instructions were clear. Document everything. Photograph every piece, every acquisition record, every communication that showed Vesper's network. Upload it all to an encrypted server. Then contact specific people. Museum directors, tribal leaders, heritage crime units, journalists who specialized in art theft. At the bottom of the document, a list of names and contact information. People Hendricks had researched. People who would know what to do with the evidence. And one final paragraph. "I destroyed your life 5 years ago because you threatened my empire. I'm giving you the chance to destroy mine. Not for revenge, for justice. These objects deserve to go home. The people they were stolen from deserve closure. You deserve vindication. Vesper and associates will try to stop you. They'll threaten you. They may try to kill you. There's a satellite phone hidden in the ventilation shaft above the main display case, secondary exit through the old mining tunnel behind the geological samples section. weapons in the locked drawer of this desk. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for what I'm asking you to do now. But you're the only person I trust to finish this. Marlo Hendricks. Thorne read it 3 times. Each time the weight of it pressed harder on his chest. This wasn't a job. It was a mission. A deathbed confession wrapped around a plea for redemption. And he was supposed to be the instrument of it. He stood up, walked the length of the vault, really looking now. Not just at the artifacts, but at what they represented. Every piece was a wound in someone's history. Every case held something that had been ripped from its context, its culture, its rightful place. He stopped at a case holding what the placard identified as a Lakota Ghost Dance shirt, circa 1890, acquired February 2001. Thorne knew enough history to understand what he was looking at. Ghost dance shirts were sacred, worn during a spiritual movement that had given desperate people hope during the worst years of genocide and forced relocation. The US government had banned the ghost dance. Soldiers had massacred people wearing these shirts at Wounded Knee, and one had ended up here, in a rich man's private collection, treated like a curiosity instead of a sacred object stained with ancestral trauma. His hands curled into fists. He moved through the vault more carefully now, reading every placard, understanding the scope of what Hendricks had done. Benin bronzes looted during British colonial violence. Pre-Columbian gold melted from larger pieces to avoid detection. Babylonian cylinder seals stolen during the Iraq War. Aboriginal sacred objects taken from burial sites. Greek and Roman pieces trafficked out of war zones. Each acquisition record told a story of corruption, payments to museum workers who'd swap real artifacts for forgeries, bribes to customs officials, shell companies, and false provenance. A whole infrastructure built to strip the world of its heritage and hide it in darkness. Thorne found a section dedicated to geological samples, his area of expertise. He recognized some of the specimens immediately. Rare minerals, meteorite fragments, crystalline formations that should have been in university collections or natural history museums. And behind that section, just as Hendricks had written, a door. Small, easy to miss. He tried the handle. Locked. The mining tunnel exit. His escape route if things went wrong, when things went wrong. Thorne went back to the desk. The locked drawer yielded easily to the letter opener he'd brought from upstairs. Inside, he found a handgun. Glock 19, loaded. 2 extra magazines, a knife, a small tactical flashlight, and a stack of cash. $50,000 in hundreds. Contingency supplies for a man who knew dangerous people were watching. Thorne had never fired a gun in his life. He stared at it, this cold metal thing that represented violence he'd never imagined needing. Slowly, carefully, he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected, real in a way that made his stomach turn. He set it back in the drawer and focused on what he could control. Documentation. That's what Hendricks wanted. That's what would matter. Thorne spent the next 6 hours photographing everything. He used the camera function on the laptop, methodical and thorough. Every artifact from multiple angles, every placard, every page of every acquisition record. The spreadsheets showing values and sources. The correspondence files showing the network of dealers and corrupt officials. It was painstaking work. His eyes burned from the screen. His back ached from bending over cases. But he kept going. Because this mattered. Because for the first time in 5 years, he was doing something that felt like it meant something beyond survival. He found Hendricks's digital files were even more damning than the physical collection. Emails discussing shipments, invoices from smugglers, photographs of artifacts being removed from archaeological sites, wire transfer records showing millions moving through offshore accounts, and everywhere the name Vesper appeared, not as a law firm, as a network, Vesper was the code name for an international smuggling operation that had been moving stolen cultural property for over 40 years. Thorne cross-referenced the contacts in Hendricks' files with the names on his instruction list. Museum directors who'd been fighting to recover stolen pieces, indigenous leaders who'd been demanding repatriation, journalists who'd been investigating the black market in antiquities. These were the people who could use this information, who would know what to do with it. He found the satellite phone exactly where Hendricks said it would be, tucked into the ventilation shaft. It was small, expensive-looking, fully charged. Thorne powered it on. It took a moment to acquire signal through the layers of earth and stone, but eventually it connected. He had communication with the outside world. He had evidence. He had instructions. What he didn't have was time. The sound came from upstairs. Faint but unmistakable. The front door opening. Thorne's blood turned to ice. He checked his watch. 2 in the afternoon. He'd been in the vault for hours, so focused he hadn't heard vehicles approach. But someone was in the house. Footsteps crossed the floor above. Multiple sets, at least 3 people, maybe more. Voices, muffled through the floor but definitely there. Thorne moved quickly, quietly. He closed all the files on the laptop, grabbed the satellite phone, and looked around desperately. There was no way to lock the basement door from down here. No way to hide what he'd discovered. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. He had maybe 30 seconds. Thorne ran to the mining tunnel door, tried it again, still locked. He needed a key he didn't have. The basement door opened above. "Mr. Caldwell?" a voice called down. Female, calm, almost friendly. "Are you down there?" He recognized the tone. Professional, controlled, dangerous. Vesper. "We know you're there," the voice continued. "We've been watching the house, saw the lights come on in the vault. Very industrious of you to start work so quickly." Footsteps on the metal stairs, descending. Thorne looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide in the vault. It was all open space and glass cases. He could see someone's legs now, coming down the stairs. Black pants, expensive boots. He did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the laptop, shoved it and the satellite phone behind a display case of Mesopotamian pottery, and stood in the center of the vault, trying to look calm. A woman emerged from the stairwell. Mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back, sharp features. She wore a black wool coat and moved with the confidence of someone used to being in control. Behind her, 2 men. Big, professional, the kind who got paid to stand behind people and look intimidating. "Mr. Caldwell," the woman said, smiling. "I'm Vesper. We spoke over email." "I thought Vesper was a firm," Thorne said. "A convenient fiction." She looked around the vault with obvious appreciation. "Impressive, isn't it? Marlowe spent 30 years building this collection. Some of these pieces are literally priceless. Can't be valued because they're too rare, too historically significant." "They're stolen," Thorne said. Vesper's smile didn't falter. "Stolen is such an ugly word. Acquired through unconventional means, rescued from war zones and corrupt governments, preserved for posterity. Hidden from the world, protected from the world." Vesper walked slowly along the cases, her fingers trailing near the glass. The world would destroy these if given the chance. Museums are political institutions. They bow to pressure, return pieces to countries that will sell them back to private collectors or let them rot in warehouses. We ensure they're properly cared for. You ensure you can profit from them. Vesper turned to face him. The smile was gone. "You're here because we need expertise. Marlowe's records are detailed, but we need current market valuations, authentication, condition assessments. You're a geologist. You understand provenance, carbon dating, mineralogical analysis. We're willing to pay you very well for that expertise." 15,000 for 2 weeks, Thorne said. That was the initial offer. But now that you've seen the scope of the collection, let's talk real numbers." Vesper nodded to one of the men. He produced a briefcase, opened it. Cash. Lots of it. $2 million. Help us properly document and prepare the collection for sale. 6 months of work, maybe a year. Then you walk away wealthy and we never speak again. Thorne stared at the money. $2 million. More than he'd make in 20 years of honest work. Enough to rebuild his life completely. "What happens to the artifacts?" he asked. "They go to private collectors who will appreciate them." "Not back to the museums? The countries they were stolen from?" Vesper's expression hardened. Those countries had their chance. They let these pieces be looted, sold, neglected. We're offering them better homes. "You're offering them to the highest bidder?" "Yes." No apology in her voice. "That's how the world works, Mr. Caldwell. You, of all people, should understand that. You tried to do the right thing 5 years ago, told the truth about Hendrix Geological. And what happened? You lost everything. Your career, your marriage, your reputation. The world punished you for having integrity." She stepped closer. "I'm offering you the chance to be rewarded instead. Take the money. Do the work. Let someone else worry about the moral implications." Thorne's mind raced. This was the choice Hendrix had predicted. The temptation. The test. "How did you know I'd be here today?" he asked. Vesper smiled. "We sent you. The email, the offer, the transportation. Colt works for us. We've been planning this since Marlowe died." "Why me?" "Because you're desperate. Because you have the skills we need. And because Marlowe left very specific instructions in his will that you be given first opportunity to assess the collection." Vesper's eyes narrowed. He had a strange sense of humor, or maybe guilt, hard to tell with dying men. "He wanted me to expose you. We assumed as much. Marlowe got sentimental in his final months, started talking about repatriation and making amends. We monitored his communications, his contacts. We know he left you some kind of message, probably playing on your conscience, appealing to your noble instincts." She gestured around the vault. "But look at what you'd be throwing away. $2 million, financial security for life. All you have to do is assess some artifacts and keep your mouth shut. That's not such a terrible price for comfort, is it? What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Thorne looked at the money, at Vesper's confident expression, at the 2 men flanking her, hands resting near their jackets where weapons probably waited. He thought about the ghost dance shirt, the Benin bronzes, the thousands of objects in this vault that represented theft, violence, and erasure. He thought about the satellite phone hidden behind the pottery case, about the evidence he'd just spent hours documenting. He thought about who he'd been 5 years ago, the man who'd stood in front of federal investigators and told the truth, even though he knew it would cost him everything. And he realized he was still that man. "No," Thorne said quietly. Vesper blinked. "Excuse me? No. I'm not helping you sell stolen artifacts. I'm not taking your money. I'm not—" One of the men moved fast, grabbed Thorne's arm, twisted it behind his back. Pain shot through his shoulder. He gasped. "Let's try this again," Vesper said, her voice ice now. "You're going to help us, willing or not. We can make this easy, or we can make it very, very difficult." The man holding Thorne increased the pressure. His shoulder joint screamed. "Here's what's going to happen," Vesper continued. "You're going to spend the next week cataloguing every piece in this vault. You're going to provide detailed assessments we can use for sales. You're going to keep your mouth shut and do exactly what we tell you." She leaned in close. "And if you don't, we'll make sure the world knows you were the mastermind behind this collection." Marlowe Hendrix kept very detailed records, including fabricated correspondence showing you helped him acquire pieces, accepted payments, provided geological cover for illegal excavations. Thorne's stomach dropped. That's not true. Truth is flexible. We have documents with your name on them. Your signature forged but convincing. Your bank account will show mysterious deposits from Hendricks shell companies. Deposits we'll make right now, retroactively dated over the past 5 years. No one will believe I was working with him. He destroyed my career. Perfect cover, don't you think? Vesper smiled. Secret partners who staged a very public falling out. Meanwhile, you were helping him loot archaeological sites under the guise of geological surveys. It's actually quite elegant. The man released Thorne's arm. He stumbled forward, clutching his shoulder. You have 24 hours to decide, Vesper said. Help us voluntarily and get paid. Refuse, and we frame you for 30 years of theft. Either way, this collection is ours. The only variable is whether you survive the process. She nodded to her associates. They moved to the stairs. We'll be back tomorrow afternoon, Vesper said from the stairwell. Have an answer ready. And Mr. Caldwell, don't try to leave. The storm has made the roads impassable. Even if you made it out of the cabin, you'd freeze to death before reaching civilization. You're trapped here with your conscience. I wonder which will break first. They ascended the stairs. Thorne heard the basement door close, footsteps crossing the floor above, the front door opening and closing, engines starting, vehicles driving away. Silence. Thorne sank to the floor, his whole body shaking. They'd threatened to frame him. They had the resources to do it. Fake documents, planted evidence, a narrative that would destroy what little remained of his reputation. If he refused, he wouldn't just lose the money. He'd lose his freedom. But if he helped them, thousands of cultural artifacts would disappear into private collections. Sacred objects would never make it home. The people Hendricks had stolen from would never get closure. Thorne pulled himself to his feet and retrieved the laptop and satellite phone from behind the pottery case. His hands were still trembling. He opened the laptop and continued where he'd left off, photographing, documenting, building the evidence file that could take Vesper down. Because he'd already made his choice. 5 years ago, he'd chosen truth over comfort. It had cost him everything. But he'd been able to sleep at night knowing he'd done the right thing. If he compromised now, he'd never sleep again. Thorne worked through the afternoon and into the evening. He photographed every remaining artifact he'd missed. He copied files from Hendricks's computer onto a thumb drive. He compiled everything into organized folders, artifacts by region, acquisition records by year, communications showing Vesper's network, financial records showing the flow of money. It was meticulous work, exhausting, but necessary. As he worked, he thought about what Vesper had said, that the world punished integrity, that he'd lost everything for telling the truth. She was right. He had lost everything. But he'd also learned something those 5 years, that you can survive losing everything. That rock bottom is solid ground, that once you have nothing left to lose, you become very dangerous to people who rely on fear. Vesper thought she was threatening a desperate man. She didn't realize she was threatening someone who'd already been destroyed and rebuilt himself from scratch. Around 9 o'clock, Thorne took a break. He went upstairs, made food, ate without tasting it. The storm had intensified. Snow piled against the windows. Wind howled through the eaves. He was trapped. Vesper was right about that. Even if he tried to run, he'd die in the wilderness. The storm was supposed to last 3 more days according to the weather radio he'd found in the kitchen. 3 days until the roads might be passable. 3 days to figure out how to get the evidence out and himself to safety. He went back downstairs with the satellite phone. It was time to start making calls. The first number on Hendricks's list belonged to Dr. Margaret Chen, Director of Repatriation at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Thorne dialed. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. Dr. Chen's office. I need to speak with Dr. Chen. It's urgent. It's about repatriation. Dr. Chen is in a meeting. Can I take a message? Tell her it's about the Hendricks collection. Tell her someone has found $300 million worth of stolen artifacts and needs her help returning them. A pause. Hold, please. 2 minutes later, a woman's voice came on the line, sharp, intelligent, suspicious. This is Margaret Chen. Who is this? My name is Thorne Caldwell. I'm calling from a vault in Montana that contains one of the largest private collections of stolen cultural property I've ever seen. I need help. He spent the next 20 minutes explaining the collection, the artifacts, Hendrix's confession, Vesper's threats. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Caldwell, what you're describing is extraordinary. If even half of it is true, this represents decades of illegal trafficking. It's all true. I have documentation, photographs, acquisition records. I can send you everything. Do it. Send it to the email address I'm going to give you. It's encrypted. And Mr. Caldwell, be very careful. If these people are who you say they are, you're in serious danger. I know. We'll move as fast as we can on our end, but you need to get out of there. I'm working on it. Thorne ended the call and immediately began uploading files. The satellite connection was slow, but steady. While the first batch uploaded, he called the next number on the list. A journalist named Rebecca Ortiz, who specialized in antiquities trafficking for the Washington Post. She answered on the second ring. Ortiz, my name is Thorne Caldwell. I have evidence of a 30-year smuggling operation involving hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen artifacts. Interested? Very. Talk to me. He explained again, sent her the same files. She asked sharp questions, wanted details, verification. I'll need to confirm some of this before I can run with it, she said. But if it checks out, this is massive. Pulitzer-level massive. Just make sure it comes out before they kill me. They've threatened you? They've threatened to frame me for the whole operation if I don't cooperate. Ortiz swore. Okay, send me everything you have. I'll start making calls. We'll get you protection. Thorne made 4 more calls. A tribal liaison officer with the Department of the Interior, an FBI agent who specialized in art crimes, a lawyer who handled repatriation cases, a museum security director Hendrix had listed as trustworthy. Each call was the same. Shock, questions, promises to act fast, warnings to be careful. By midnight, Thorne had sent evidence files to 8 different people across multiple organizations. The information was out. Even if something happened to him, even if Vesper destroyed the vault, the truth would survive. He felt lighter, exhausted but lighter. Thorne went upstairs and collapsed on the couch. He needed sleep. Needed to think clearly. Vesper would be back in less than 12 hours expecting an answer. He'd give her one she wasn't expecting. Sleep came hard, fractured by nightmares of being buried in snow while artifacts screamed in languages he couldn't understand. He woke to grey dawn light and the sound of engines. Vesper was early. Thorne scrambled up, looked out the window. 3 black SUVs parked in front of the cabin. Doors opening, people emerging. More than yesterday, at least 8 of them. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an extraction. Thorne ran to the basement, grabbed the gun from the desk drawer. His hands shook as he checked the magazine. Fully loaded, safety on. He'd never fired a weapon in his life. Wasn't sure he could pull the trigger, even if he needed to. But he tucked it into his waistband anyway. Footsteps on the porch. The front door crashed open. Mr. Caldwell! Vesper's voice, sharp now, angry. I know what you did. I know you made calls, sent files. Thorne stood at the top of the basement stairs, heart hammering. You made a very stupid choice, Vesper continued. Her footsteps moved through the house, searching. Did you really think we wouldn't notice? We monitor satellite communications in this area. Every call you made, every file you sent, we know about it. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. 6 people behind her now, some holding weapons openly. Here's what's going to happen, Vesper said. You're going to send a follow-up message to everyone you contacted. Tell them it was a hoax, mental breakdown, false alarm. Then you're going to disappear. Tragic accident in the storm. Body never recovered. People know I'm here, Thorne said. Colt dropped you off and left. We have him on record saying you were unstable, talking about conspiracies. When you disappear, it'll be sad but not surprising. Unstable man, remote location, harsh weather. These things happen. She pulled out a phone. Make the calls, now. Thorne's hand moved to the gun at his back. I wouldn't, Vesper said. She nodded. 2 of her people raised weapons, professional, trained. You're outgunned and trapped. This doesn't have to end badly. Make the calls and we'll make it quick. Refuse and we'll make it slow. Thorne's mind raced. He was trapped, outgunned. The evidence was out, but that wouldn't save him in the next 60 seconds. Then he remembered Hendricks' instructions. Secondary exit, mining tunnel, behind the geological samples. He just needed to get back downstairs. Okay, Thorne said, raising his hands. Okay, I'll make the calls. But my phone is downstairs, the satellite phone. Vesper studied him. Marcus, go with him. He tries anything. Shoot him. One of the armed men moved forward. Big, professional, face carved from stone. Thorne descended the basement stairs with Marcus 2 steps behind, gun trained on his back. At the bottom, Thorne moved toward the desk where he'd left the satellite phone. Slower, Marcus ordered. Thorne slowed. He needed to get to the mining tunnel exit, needed Marcus to get close enough. He reached the desk, picked up the satellite phone with shaking hands. Turn around, Marcus said. Thorne turned. Marcus was 6 feet away, gun steady, professional. Thorne did the only thing he could think of. He threw the satellite phone hard at Marcus's face. Marcus dodged. Instinct. Training. Thorne lunged. Thorne crashed into Marcus with all his weight, driving his shoulder into the bigger man's chest. They went down hard, Marcus's gun clattering across the concrete floor. Thorne had never been a fighter, had never thrown a punch outside of high school, but desperation makes animals of civilized men. Marcus recovered fast, drove his elbow into Thorne's ribs. Pain exploded through his side. He gasped, rolled away. Marcus scrambled for his weapon. Thorne kicked it. The gun skittered under a display case 20 feet away. "Help!" Marcus shouted. "He's—" Thorne didn't let him finish. He grabbed a bronze statue from the nearest case, heavy and ancient, and swung it like a club. It connected with Marcus's shoulder. The man grunted, stumbled back. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Thorne ran, not toward the stairs, toward the back of the vault, toward the geological samples section, toward the small door Hendricks had promised would lead to freedom. He reached it as the first of Vesper's people emerged from the stairwell. Tried the handle. Still locked. Bullets sparked off the stone wall beside his head. He ducked behind a display case of Mayan pottery. More shots. Glass shattered. Priceless artifacts exploded into fragments. Thorne pulled the gun from his waistband. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. He'd never fired a weapon. Didn't know if he could. "Stop shooting!" Vesper's voice cut through the chaos. "You'll destroy the collection!" The gunfire ceased. Thorne crouched behind the case, breathing hard, mind racing. He needed to open that door, needed a key he didn't have, needed— Wait. He fumbled in his pocket. The brass key, the one that had opened the basement door. It had been left for him deliberately. What if it opened more than one lock? "Mr. Caldwell," Vesper called out. "You're only making this worse. There's nowhere to go. Surrender now, and I promise it'll be quick." Thorne crawled to the mining tunnel door, staying low. Another display case exploded above him. So much for not destroying the collection. He reached the door, slid the brass key into the lock with trembling fingers. It turned. The door swung open, revealing darkness and the smell of earth and cold stone. A tunnel, narrow, descending. "He's got the tunnel!" someone shouted. Thorne squeezed through the door and slammed it behind him. There was a heavy bolt on this side. He threw it just as something crashed against the door from the vault side. The bolt held. For now. Thorn turned and ran into darkness, one hand trailing the wall, the other holding the gun he still wasn't sure he could use. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders. The walls were rough stone, old mining work from decades or maybe a century ago. Behind him, the pounding on the door intensified, then stopped. Voices, muffled. They'd be looking for another way around, or tools to break through. Thorn ran faster, blind in the absolute darkness. His boots splashed through puddles. The air grew colder. The tunnel sloped downward, then leveled out, then started climbing. He had no idea where it led, no idea how long it was. Just ran because stopping meant dying. His lungs burned. His ribs screamed where Marcus had elbowed him. The darkness pressed in like a physical weight. Then, ahead, a change. Not light exactly, but less dark. Grey instead of black. Thorn pushed toward it, hope surging in his chest. The tunnel ended at a vertical shaft with rusted metal rungs set into the stone. Above, maybe 30 feet up, he could see sky. Grey, snowing, beautiful. He started climbing. The rungs were icy, treacherous. Twice his boots slipped and his heart stopped, but he kept climbing, hand over hand, up toward the storm and freedom. He emerged into a world of white, snow everywhere, falling thick and fast, wind that cut like knives. He was in the forest, maybe a quarter mile from the cabin. He could see smoke from the chimney through the trees. No time to celebrate. They'd figure out where the tunnel led soon enough. Thorn oriented himself. Downhill was generally the right direction in mountains. Follow the drainage. Find a stream. Streams lead to rivers. Rivers lead to people. He started walking, then jogging, then running as best he could through knee-deep snow. The cold hit him immediately. He'd left his coat in the cabin. Wore only jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots. Already his fingers were going numb. His ears burned with cold, but he ran anyway. Behind him, distant but clear, the sound of shouting. They'd found the tunnel exit. Thorn pushed harder. The forest was dense here, pine and spruce heavy with snow. He used the trees for cover, zigzagging, trying to make his trail harder to follow. But fresh snow showed every step like a beacon. He ran for 20 minutes before his body started to fail. His legs felt like lead. His lungs couldn't pull in enough air. The cold was everywhere now, in his bones, slowing his thoughts. Hypothermia. He recognized the signs from survival training he'd done years ago for field work. Confusion, slowed movement, the dangerous urge to just sit down and rest. Can't stop. Keep moving. Movement is warmth. Stopping is death. He crested a small ridge and saw it below, a frozen stream. And following the stream, what looked like an old logging road, overgrown but still visible under the snow. Roads led somewhere. Anywhere was better than here. Thorn half ran, half fell down the slope. His numb feet couldn't feel the ground properly. He crashed through brush, bounced off trees, kept moving through sheer will. He reached the logging road and turned downhill. The going was easier here, flatter. He could move faster. Behind him, the shouting was closer. They had vehicles. They knew these woods. He was leaving a trail a child could follow. He wasn't going to make it. The thought came clear and cold. He was going to die out here, freeze or get caught. Either way, the evidence he'd sent out was all that would remain. At least he'd done that much. Then he saw it through the snow. A structure, small, dark, a hunting cabin or ranger station, maybe 100 yards off the road. Thorn changed direction, stumbling through drifts toward it. Please be unlocked. Please have supplies. Please. The door was locked. He wanted to scream. Instead, he smashed the window with his elbow, reached through, cut his arm on broken glass, didn't care. Got the door open from inside. The cabin was tiny, one room, abandoned. But it had walls and a roof, and that meant shelter from the wind. Thorn collapsed inside, shaking violently. His fingers were white, his feet had no feeling. The cut on his arm bled freely, red on white snow. He forced himself to move, searched the cabin, found an old wood stove, matches in a tin, firewood stacked against the wall, dry under a tarp. His fingers wouldn't work properly. Took him 6 tries to light a match. It died. Tried again. And again. Finally, a flame caught the kindling. Thorn fed it carefully, building the fire while his body shook so hard he could barely control his hands. Smoke filled the cabin until the draft caught and pulled it up the chimney. Warmth. Blessed, beautiful warmth. He huddled close to the stove, rubbing his hands, his feet, checking for frostbite. His fingers were pale but started pinking up as blood returned. His toes were worse, white and numb. He rubbed them frantically. Come on, feel something. Pain shot through his feet. Excruciating. He nearly cried out but bit it back. Pain meant blood flow. Pain meant tissue damage but not death. He pulled off his wet flannel shirt, found an old blanket on a cot in the corner, moth-eaten but dry, wrapped himself in it. Outside, the storm continued. The wind howled, snow piled against the windows, and somewhere out there, Vesper's people were hunting him. Thorn knew he had maybe an hour before they found this place, maybe less. But for now, he had fire and walls and a moment to think. He looked at the gun still clutched in his hand. 9 rounds left if it had a full magazine. He checked. 17-round magazine, minus the one in the chamber. He had no idea how many shots had been fired in the vault chaos. Didn't matter. He had bullets, still didn't know if he could use them. His whole life, Thorn had solved problems with his mind, with data and analysis and careful observation. Violence was foreign to him. Even now, running for his life, the idea of actually shooting someone made him sick. But Vesper's people wouldn't hesitate. He thought about the past 5 years, about the man he'd been and the man he'd become. Before the scandal, Thorn Caldwell had been someone, respected, successful, married to a woman he loved. They'd had plans, kids someday, a house with a garden, normal, beautiful plans. He'd met Sable in graduate school. She was studying environmental law. He was finishing his geology doctorate. They'd bonded over a shared belief that science and law could protect the world from exploitation. Naive, maybe, but sincere. They'd married young, 24 and 23. Everyone said they were rushing. But when you find someone who sees the world the way you do, why wait? The first few years were good. He built his career. She built hers. They bought a small house in Helena, talked about starting a family once things settled down. Then came the Hendricks geological job. Thorn had been so proud when he got hired. It was a major firm. The salary was twice what he'd been making. Sable had hugged him, told him she was proud. They celebrated with cheap wine and big dreams. He'd been with the company for 3 years when they sent him to the Bitterroot Range survey. Routine work. Assess the geological stability and mineral content of a proposed mining site. He'd done dozens of similar jobs, but this one was different. The site was remote, beautiful, pristine forest and mountain streams, the kind of place that made you remember why you became a geologist in the first place. Thorn had set up his equipment, taken his samples, run his tests. Everything normal, until he noticed the readings were off. Heavy metals in the soil, way too high for natural occurrence. He'd expanded his survey area, taken more samples, all contaminated. He'd followed the contamination to its source, a ravine on the far edge of the property. Someone had dumped there barrels and barrels of industrial waste, buried shallow, leaking into the groundwater. Thorn had documented everything, photographed the barrels, tested the contents, toxic sludge, carcinogenic, the kind of thing that gave whole communities cancer. He'd reported it to his supervisor, expecting praise for catching something serious. Instead, he got called into a meeting with Marlo Hendricks himself. Hendricks had been smooth, charming. He'd thanked Thorn for his thoroughness, said the company would handle it through proper channels. Asked Thorne to keep quiet until they could investigate further. Didn't want to alarm anyone prematurely. Thorne had agreed. It seemed reasonable. 2 weeks later, Thorne went back to check on the cleanup progress. The ravine had been filled in, bulldozed, covered with topsoil and planted with fast-growing grasses. The barrels were still there, just buried deeper. That's when he understood. Hendricks Geological hadn't dumped the waste. But they'd been hired by someone who had, and they were covering it up instead of reporting it. Thorne had gone to federal environmental regulators, brought his evidence, his photographs, his soil samples, his meticulous documentation. The investigation had taken 8 months. During that time, Hendricks Geological fought back. They questioned Thorne's methodology, suggested his samples were contaminated in his own lab, hinted he had a history of mental instability, fabricated performance reviews claiming his work had always been subpar. Sable stood by him at first, but the legal bills mounted. Thorne's name got dragged through industry publications. He became toxic. No one would hire him. Colleagues he'd known for years stopped returning calls. The stress ate at their marriage, fights about money, about why he'd had to be the hero, about whether it was worth destroying their lives over some barrels in the middle of nowhere. The federal investigation eventually confirmed Thorne's findings. The site was contaminated, fines were issued, Hendricks Geological settled for an undisclosed amount. But by then, Thorne's reputation was destroyed. The industry believed Hendricks's version, that Thorne had been a disgruntled employee, that his findings were exaggerated. Sable filed for divorce 6 months after the investigation closed. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said, voice hollow with exhaustion. "I can't watch you destroy yourself fighting battles you can't win. I can't be poor and scared and angry forever." "We were supposed to change the world together," Thorne had said. "We were kids," she'd replied. "We grew up." The divorce was finalized 3 years ago. Thorne had signed the papers in a gas station bathroom because he was living out of his truck at the time and didn't have an address. He'd spent the next 2 years drifting. Odd jobs, manual labor, anything that paid cash. He'd hit bottom in a motel room in Great Falls, staring at a bottle of pills and wondering if anyone would even notice if he disappeared. But he'd put the pills down, because somewhere under the wreckage of his life, he was still the man who documented toxic waste instead of looking the other way. The man who'd told the truth even when it cost him everything. That man deserved a chance to rebuild. So Thorne had dragged himself back to something like life, got the apartment in Billings, started doing repair work, lived small and quiet, and tried to forget he'd ever been someone who mattered. Until 3 days ago when an email offered him $15,000 and a chance at redemption. Now here he was, freezing in an abandoned cabin, hunted by criminals, having sent evidence that could take down a major smuggling operation to 8 different organizations. He'd done it again, chosen truth over survival, principle over pragmatism, and just like last time, it was probably going to get him killed. But sitting there, warming his frozen hands by the fire, bleeding from a cut on his arm, Thorne realized something. He didn't regret it. Not this time. Not like he'd regretted it during the darkest days of the divorce, during the nights sleeping in his truck, during the moments when he'd questioned whether integrity was worth the price. This time felt different, because this time he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the Lakota people who deserved their ghost dance shirt back, for the tribes whose sacred objects had been stolen, for the countries whose heritage had been looted, for all the nameless, faceless people whose history Hendricks had treated like trophies. This time, the fight meant something beyond his own conscience. Thorne checked his watch. He'd been in the cabin for 40 minutes. The fire had warmed the small space. His fingers worked again. His feet still hurt, but the color was better. He needed to move. Needed to keep going before Vesper found him. He searched the cabin more thoroughly, found a rusty hunting knife, a length of rope, a can of beans, a water bottle, an old poncho. Survival supplies. He put on the poncho, pocketed the knife and rope, tucked the gun into his waistband, ate half the beans cold from the can. They tasted like metal and hope. Outside, the storm had lessened slightly, still snowing, but the wind had died down. Thorne opened the door and stepped out into white silence. Which way? He oriented himself by the slope of the land. Downhill. Always downhill. He started walking, staying in the trees, moving as quietly as he could through the snow. He made it maybe 200 yards before he heard engines, snowmobiles, at least 3 of them, coming fast. Thorne ran. The trees were thick here, too tight for the snowmobiles to follow easily. He used that, weaving between trunks, ducking under low branches. His feet were blocks of wood. His lungs burned. The snowmobiles circled, trying to cut him off. He changed direction. Uphill now. Harder, but unexpected. They'd think he'd go down toward civilization. The engines grew louder. They were closing in. Thorne burst through a line of trees and found himself at the edge of a ravine, maybe 40 feet across, steep sides, frozen stream at the bottom. The snowmobiles were seconds behind. He didn't think, just jumped. The landing was brutal. He hit the slope hard, tumbled, crashed through brush and over rocks, came to rest at the bottom in a pile of snow and pain. Above, the snowmobiles stopped at the edge. He heard voices, arguing. He went over. Is he dead? Go around. There's a way down a quarter mile up. Thorne forced himself to move. Every part of his body screamed. His ankle might be sprained. His ribs definitely bruised. Didn't matter. He crawled out of the ravine on the far side, using roots and rocks, pulled himself up and over the edge, kept moving. The forest opened up ahead. He could see through the trees, a clearing, and in that clearing, something that made his heart leap. A road, a real road, plowed, with tire tracks. Thorne ran for it, every step agony, every breath a prayer. He reached the road just as a truck came around the bend. Civilian. Old Ford. Rust spots and a gun rack. Thorne stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms. The truck slammed on its brakes, fishtailed, stopped inches from him. The driver jumped out. Old man, maybe 70, flannel and suspicion. What in the hell? Please, Thorne gasped. I need help. People are trying to kill me. The old man looked him over, saw the blood, the bruises, the wild eyes. You on drugs, son? No, Thorne heard the snowmobiles. Closer now. Please, I'm a witness. Federal case. They're hunting me. The old man's eyes narrowed. Then he made a decision. Get in the truck, now! Thorne scrambled into the passenger seat. The old man gunned the engine. They took off down the road just as the snowmobiles emerged from the trees. They following? The old man asked. Thorne looked back. The snowmobiles had stopped at the tree line, not following. Probably couldn't risk being seen by a civilian. No, Thorne breathed. They stopped. Good. Now you want to tell me what kind of mess you've gotten yourself into? Thorne slumped in the seat, shaking with relief and cold and adrenaline crash. It's a long story. Lucky for you, it's a long drive to town. The old man stuck out a calloused hand. Name's Walter McCrae. I run cattle when the weather's decent. Who are you running from? Thorne Caldwell. And I'm running from people who traffic stolen artifacts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Walter let out a low whistle. Well, that's a new one. In my day, folks around here just ran from the law or angry husbands. Despite everything, Thorne almost smiled. They drove in silence for a few minutes. The heater blasted warm air. Thorne felt his body slowly coming back to life. Where you headed? Walter asked. Nearest police station, FBI office, anywhere with law enforcement who can protect me. That'd be Missoula, about 90 miles. We're way out in the sticks here. 90 miles. 2 hours, maybe. Thorne could survive 2 hours. There a phone I can use? He asked. I need to make some calls. Walter nodded toward the glove box. Got a cell phone in there. Service is spotty, but we're heading toward better coverage. Thorne pulled out the phone. Ancient flip phone, but functional. 1 bar of service. He dialed the first number he could remember from Hendrix's list. Dr. Margaret Chen at the Smithsonian. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Dr. Chen, it's Thorne Caldwell. I'm the one who called about the Hendrix collection. Mr. Caldwell, we've been trying to reach you. The evidence you sent, it's extraordinary. We've already contacted Homeland Security, the FBI Art Crime Team, Interpol. There are task forces mobilizing, but we need you alive to testify. I'm working on that. I'm with a civilian about 90 miles outside Missoula. Vesper's people tried to kill me. I escaped, but they know I've sent out the information. Where's the collection? Still in the vault. Remote cabin. I have coordinates, but... Thorne realized he didn't have coordinates. Didn't even know exactly where he'd been. Walter, he said, turning to the old man. Can you tell me where we are? Where that forest road was? Walter rattled off township and range numbers, Forest Service road designations. Thorne relayed them to Dr. Chen. We're sending federal agents immediately, she said. But Mr. Caldwell, you need to get to safety. These people, if they're as connected as your evidence suggests, they have resources. They might have people in local law enforcement. What do I do? Get to Missoula. Go straight to the federal building. Ask for Agent Sarah Drummond. She's already been briefed. She'll protect you. And Mr. Caldwell, what you've done, exposing this network, it's going to change everything. Dozens of countries will get their heritage back. Indigenous communities will get sacred objects returned. You've done something remarkable. I just documented what Hendrix told me to document. You chose to do it when you could have taken their money and walked away. That choice matters. Thorne ended the call and sat back. His hands were still shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving exhaustion and pain. You really find hundreds of millions in stolen artifacts? Walter asked. Yeah? And they offered you money to keep quiet? $2 million. Walter whistled again. That's life-changing money. Would have been. Why didn't you take it? Thorne looked out the window at the snow-covered mountains sliding past. Because 5 years ago, I lost everything for telling the truth about toxic waste dumping. Lost my career, my marriage, my reputation. And I spent those 5 years wondering if it was worth it. If integrity was just a fancy word for stupidity. He turned to Walter. This time, I got a chance to choose again. Truth or money. Principle or survival. And I realized I'm still the guy who documents the toxic waste, even when it costs me everything, especially then. Walter nodded slowly. World needs more people like you. World punishes people like me. Sometimes, but not always. You're still breathing. That means you get another chance. They drove on. The snow lessened. The roads got better. Cell service improved. Thorne made more calls. To Rebecca Ortiz at the Washington Post. To the FBI Art Crimes Division. To the tribal liaison. To everyone who needed to know he was alive and the evidence was real. Each call, he gave them the coordinates Walter had provided. Each call, they promised federal agents were mobilizing, that the vault would be secured, that Vesper's network would be dismantled. By the time they reached the outskirts of Missoula, the sun was setting behind the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and white and cold. Walter pulled up to the federal building downtown. This where you need to be? Yeah, thank you. You saved my life. Walter shrugged. Just gave you a ride. You saved your own life by doing the right thing. Takes guts. Thorne got out of the truck. His legs barely held him. His body was a map of pain and cold and exhaustion. He walked up the steps to the federal building, pushed through the doors, and approached the security desk. I need to see Agent Sarah Drummond. My name is Thorne Caldwell. I'm expected. The guard made a call. 2 minutes later, a woman in a dark suit appeared. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, official bearing. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Agent Drummond. We've been waiting for you." She looked him over. "You look like hell." "I feel worse. Come with me. We have a medical team standing by and about a dozen agencies who want to debrief you." As they walked through the building, Drummond spoke quietly. "What you've given us is massive. We've already secured warrants for the cabin. Tactical teams are en route. And the intelligence in those files you sent, we're tracking smuggling routes through 6 countries. This is going to break open cases we've been working for years." "What about Vesper?" "We identified several people from the evidence, already have agents moving on multiple targets, but we need your testimony. You're the only person who can directly connect Hendricks to the collection, Vesper to the threats, all of it. They tried to frame me, said they had documents with my signature, bank records showing I was Hendricks's partner. We found those files in the laptop. They were prepared but never deployed. Digital forensics can prove their forgeries. You're not in danger of prosecution, Mr. Caldwell. You're a protected witness now." They reached a conference room. Inside, more people in suits. FBI, Homeland Security, State Department, even a representative from UNESCO. Thorne sat down, accepted coffee he could barely hold with his shaking hands, and began to talk. He talked for 6 hours, told them everything. From the initial email to the vault discovery, to Hendricks's video confession, to Vesper's threats to his escape through the mining tunnel. They recorded it all, asked questions, verified details against the documentation he'd sent. By the time they finished, it was past midnight. "We have enough," Drummond said. "Get some rest. We've arranged a secure location. Tomorrow we'll need more detailed debriefings, but for now, you've done your part." A marshal escorted Thorne to an unmarked car. They drove to a hotel on the edge of town. Secure floor, guards outside. The room was bland but clean and safe. Thorne stripped off his ruined clothes, stood under a hot shower until the water ran clear instead of brown with dirt and blood. Examined his injuries in the mirror. Bruises everywhere. Cut on his arm that probably needed stitches. Sprained ankle swollen to twice normal size, but alive. He collapsed into bed and fell into dreamless sleep. He woke to knocking, sat up, disoriented. Sunlight streamed through the window. The marshal from last night stood in the doorway with a tray. "Breakfast, and you have visitors. Agent Drummond and some people who've been waiting to meet you." Thorne dressed in clean clothes someone had provided, ate scrambled eggs and toast, drank coffee that finally had flavor. Drummond arrived with 3 people. The first was Dr. Margaret Chen. She shook his hand with both of hers. "Mr. Caldwell, on behalf of indigenous communities around the world, thank you." The second was an older man who introduced himself as James White Eagle, representing a coalition of tribal nations. "The items you helped recover, they're not just artifacts to us, they're our ancestors, our connection to who we are. What you did brought them home." The third was Rebecca Ortiz. "Your story breaks tomorrow. Front page. We're calling it the Hendricks Vault. Biggest repatriation case in history." Thorne didn't know what to say. "I just documented what was there." "You chose to do it when it would have been easier and more profitable to walk away," Dr. Chen said. That choice changed everything. Over the next hour, they briefed him on what was happening. Federal agents had secured the vault, recovered all 334 artifacts, arrested 4 of Vesper's associates. Vesper herself had disappeared, but Interpol had issued warrants in 40 countries. The collection was being catalogued by experts. Pieces were already being matched to theft reports going back decades. Countries were filing repatriation claims. Tribal nations were preparing to receive sacred objects that had been missing for generations. "There's going to be a long process," Dr. Chen explained. "Legal proceedings, authentication, working out the logistics of returns, but it's happening because you made it possible." That afternoon, Thorne gave more interviews to FBI, to State Department officials coordinating international returns, to museum directors who wanted to understand the provenance of pieces that might end up in their care. He told the story over and over until his voice was hoarse. That evening, Drummond found him alone in the hotel conference room they'd been using. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know. This all feels surreal." "You've had a hell of a week." "I keep thinking about Hendrix, how he built this collection for 30 years, how it consumed him, and how in the end he wanted to make it right, but couldn't do it himself. So he engineered this whole thing to force someone else to do it." "You think he was looking for redemption?" "I think he was looking for courage and couldn't find it, so he borrowed mine." Drummond sat down across from him. "For what it's worth, what you did took more than courage. It took integrity, a quality that's in short supply. Integrity destroyed my life once before. But you chose it again anyway." Thorne thought about that, about the choice he'd made in the vault when Vesper offered $2 million, about how easy it would have been to say yes, to take the money and let someone else worry about stolen artifacts. "Yeah," he said finally, "I guess I did." "You know they're going to want you involved in the repatriation process. Your testimony will be crucial in the criminal cases, and museums are going to want your help verifying provenance, consulting on geological samples in the collection. I'm not qualified for that. I'm not a museum professional. You're the person who saved $300 million in cultural heritage from disappearing forever. I think you're qualified." That night, alone in his hotel room, Thorne sat by the window and looked out at the Missoula lights. His phone, his real phone recovered from the cabin by federal agents, had 37 missed calls. One was from Sable. He stared at her name for a long time, then dialed. She answered immediately. "Thorne, oh my God, Thorne, I saw the news. Are you okay?" "Yeah, beat up, but okay." "They're saying you exposed a major smuggling operation, that you risked your life to recover stolen artifacts." "That's basically accurate." Silence. Then her voice soft. "You did it again, didn't you? Chose the hard right over the easy wrong. I guess old habits die hard." "I'm proud of you," her voice cracked. "I know I left. I know I gave up on us. But seeing you on the news, seeing you still being the man who tells the truth no matter the cost, it reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place." Thorne felt his throat tighten. "Sable, I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know, what you did matters. You matter, and I'm sorry I couldn't see that when we were drowning in bills and fear. We were both drowning. But you never stopped being you, even when it would have been easier. That's something special, Thorne. Don't forget that." They talked for another hour, about the divorce, about the years apart, about what came next. No promises, no grand declarations, just two people who'd loved each other once, talking honestly about who they'd become. When Thorne finally hung up, he felt something shift inside him. Not healing exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. The recognition that he'd survived, that he'd chosen principle over pragmatism twice now, and somehow, against all odds, was still standing. Actually more than standing. For the first time in 5 years, Thorne Caldwell felt like himself again. 3 weeks after Thorne Caldwell stumbled out of a frozen Montana forest, he stood in a federal courtroom watching the first of Vesper's associates being arraigned. The man, identified as Marcus Vail, the same Marcus who'd fought him in the vault, looked smaller now in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. Thorne sat in the gallery beside Agent Drummond. His ribs were still taped, his ankle still wrapped. But he was alive, and Marcus Vail was facing 23 counts of trafficking in stolen cultural property, conspiracy, and attempted murder. "How does it feel?" Drummond whispered. "Surreal," Thorne admitted. "A month ago I was fixing leaky faucets. Now I'm watching federal prosecutors dismantle an international smuggling ring. You started this. You could have walked away rich. Instead, you're the reason 12 people are in custody and hundreds of artifacts are going home. 12 arrests so far, more coming. The evidence Thorne had documented was a roadmap to Vesper's entire operation. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies in Delaware and Luxembourg, corrupt customs officials in 7 countries, museum employees who'd been swapping originals for forgeries, archaeologists who'd been looting sites and selling to private collectors. The scope was staggering. But Vesper herself remained missing, disappeared the day after Thorne escaped. Interpol had her flagged at every border. Her accounts were frozen. Her network was collapsing. But she'd vanished like smoke. "We'll find her," Drummond said, reading his thoughts. "People like that always surface eventually. They can't help themselves." After the arraignment, Thorne met with the prosecution team. They wanted to go over his testimony again, prepare for the trials that would stretch over the next year. "You're going to be spending a lot of time in courtrooms," the lead prosecutor warned. "Defense attorneys will try to discredit you, bring up the Hendricks geological case, paint you as someone with a vendetta." "Let them," Thorne said. "I documented everything. The evidence speaks for itself." "It does, but juries like narratives. We need yours to be unshakable." Thorne spent the afternoon in a conference room going over timelines, dates, and details. What he'd seen, what he'd photographed, what Hendricks had told him, what Vesper had threatened. By the time they finished, it was dark outside. Drummond drove him back to the hotel. He was still in protective custody, still using marshals for security. Vesper was out there somewhere, and she had resources. "You have visitors tomorrow," Drummond said as they pulled up. "The Lakota delegation. They want to meet you before the repatriation ceremony." "Ceremony?" "The ghost dance shirt you found. It's being returned to the Rosebud Sioux tribe. They're holding a ceremony. They want you there." Thorne's throat tightened. "I'm not sure that's appropriate. I'm not Lakota. I'm just the person who—" "You're the person who brought their ancestors' sacred object home. Trust me, they want you there." The next morning, 5 people arrived at the hotel conference room. 3 elders, a tribal attorney, and James White Eagle, who Thorne had met before. They sat in a circle. One of the elders, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen lifetimes, spoke first. "My name is Grace Tallbear. My great-great-grandmother wore a shirt like the one you found. She was at Wounded Knee. She survived. But her shirt was taken, along with many others. My family has been looking for it for 4 generations. Thorne felt the weight of that. 4 generations. Over 100 years of searching. "We never thought we'd see it again," Grace continued. "Thought it was lost, destroyed, in some museum basement labeled as unknown provenance. But you found it. You protected it. You made sure it came home." "I just documented what was there," Thorne said quietly. "You chose to document it when you could have looked away. That choice matters to us, to our children, to our ancestors." Another elder, a man named Thomas Kills Thunder, leaned forward. "Do you understand what the ghost dance was?" "Some," Thorne said. "A spiritual movement, 1880s and 90s. People were trying to find hope during the worst years of genocide." "It was prophecy," Thomas said. "A vision that said the old ways would return, that the buffalo would come back, that our ancestors would rise and we would be free again. The government feared it, banned it, sent soldiers to stop it." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "At Wounded Knee, they massacred 300 people, men, women, children. Many were wearing ghost dance shirts. They believed the shirts would protect them. They didn't. But they gave them courage to face death with dignity." "Those shirts are sacred," Grace added. "They're not artifacts. They're prayers made cloth. They're our grandmother's courage. And one of them was stolen and hidden for 134 years. Until you." Thorne didn't know what to say. The magnitude of it pressed on his chest like a physical weight. "The ceremony is in 4 days," James White Eagle said, "at the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. We'd be honored if you'd attend, not as a spectator, as a guest. as someone who helped heal a wound that's been bleeding for over a century. "I'll be there," Thorne managed. They talked for another hour about the other Native American items in the collection. Burial goods, ceremonial objects, sacred bundles, all being prepared for return to their respective tribes. "What Hendricks did," Grace said as they were leaving, "taking these things, hiding them, that was violence, cultural violence. But what you did, bringing them to light, getting them home, that's healing. You helped heal something that's been broken for longer than any of us have been alive." After they left, Thorne sat alone in the conference room for a long time. He'd understood intellectually what the artifacts represented, but hearing it from the people whose ancestors had been stolen from, that made it real in a way documentation never could. He pulled out his phone and called his mother. He hadn't spoken to her in months. The estrangement had been mutual, born of shame and disappointment after the divorce. She answered on the third ring. "Thorne? Hey, Mom. I saw the news, saw what you did. Honey, are you okay?" They talked for an hour. She cried, told him she was proud, told him she'd never stopped believing in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. "Your father would have been so proud," she said. Thorne's dad had died when he was 19, a geologist too, honest to a fault. "I keep thinking about what Dad used to say, about how the rocks don't lie, how data doesn't care about politics or money. It just is. And you've lived by that, even when it cost you everything. Twice now. And you're still standing. That's not weakness, baby. That's strength." The next few days were a blur of meetings, interviews, and preparation. Rebecca Ortiz's article in the Washington Post had gone viral. International media picked it up. Suddenly, Thorne Caldwell was a name people knew. The mechanic who exposed a $300 million smuggling ring. The whistleblower who chose integrity over wealth. The man who brought stolen heritage home. Reporters wanted interviews. He declined most of them. This wasn't about him. It was about the artifacts, about the people they belonged to. But he did agree to one interview with a small indigenous news outlet, because they understood what the story was really about. 4 days after meeting the Lakota delegation, Thorne found himself on a plane to South Dakota. Agent Drummond went with him. Security was still tight. Vesper was still missing. They landed in Rapid City and drove to the Rosebud Reservation. The landscape was stark, beautiful, rolling prairie under an endless sky. The ceremony was being held in a community center. When Thorne arrived, there were already hundreds of people there, families, elders, children, all gathering to welcome home something that had been stolen from them. Grace Tallbear met him at the door. She was wearing traditional dress, beadwork that must have taken months to create. "You came," she said, smiling. "I said I would. White people don't always keep their promises to us." Thorne didn't know how to respond to that. It was true, so he just said, "I'm here." The ceremony was unlike anything he'd experienced. Drumming, singing, prayers in Lakota that he couldn't understand but felt anyway. The ghost dance shirt sat on a special stand, carefully preserved in a climate-controlled case. Elder after elder spoke about what the shirt meant, about the relatives who'd worn them, about Wounded Knee, about survival and resistance and the long walk back to wholeness. Then Grace stood and said something that made Thorne's chest tighten. "We want to honor the person who brought this home, Thorne Caldwell. Come forward, please." Thorne stood on shaking legs, walked to the center of the circle, hundreds of eyes on him. Grace placed a blanket around his shoulders, star quilt, handmade, beautiful. "In our way," she said, "when someone does something of great importance for the people, we honor them with a blanket. This blanket was made by the women of our community. It represents our gratitude, our recognition that you did something that mattered." Thorne couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to the moment. Thomas Kill's thunder stepped forward. "You gave us back our grandmother's courage. We give you our respect and our friendship. You are welcome here, always." The drums started again. People began to dance, not the ghost dance that was specific and sacred, but a round dance, celebration, healing. Someone pulled Thorn into the circle. He didn't know the steps, didn't matter. He moved with them, this community that had welcomed him despite everything, despite being a white man, despite being an outsider, because he'd done one thing that mattered. He'd told the truth. Afterward, families came up to him, thanked him, told him stories about their relatives who'd been at Wounded Knee, who'd worn ghost dance shirts, who'd believed in the prophecy of return and renewal. One old woman, must have been 90, took his hand. My grandmother told me about the shirts, said someday they'd come home. I didn't believe her, thought it was just an old woman's hope. But here you are, here it is. Maybe the prophecy was true after all. Maybe the old ways are returning. Thorn stayed for the feast that followed, ate fry bread and wajipi, listened to stories, watched children play, felt something shift inside him. Something that had been broken for 5 years, starting to knit back together. This was why he'd refused Vesper's money. This moment, this healing, this joy. Late that night, back in his hotel in Rapid City, Thorn stood at the window looking out at the Black Hills. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Margaret Chen. First international return scheduled. Egyptian Ushabti figures going back to Cairo in 2 weeks. They want you there if you're available. He texted back. I'll be there. What happens next will show how one person's choice rippled across continents, changed lives he'd never meet, and proved that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't just cost everything. Sometimes it gives back more than you ever imagined. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Over the next 6 months, Thorn Caldwell became something he never expected. A consultant, an advocate, a bridge between the world that had stolen and the world that was reclaiming. He traveled to Egypt for the return of the Ushabti figures, stood in the Cairo Museum while the director spoke about cultural heritage and the importance of repatriation. He went to Greece when the marble reliefs were returned to Athens, watched scholars weep as they examined pieces they'd only seen in blurry photographs in stolen art databases. He flew to Nigeria when the Benin bronzes came home, heard the stories of how British colonial forces had looted the royal palace in 1897, how families had been searching for these pieces for over a century. Each return was different, each ceremony unique. But the emotion was universal. Joy, relief, the feeling of something severed being reattached, something broken becoming whole. And everywhere he went, people thanked him, not just for finding the artifacts, but for choosing to give them back instead of profiting from them. You could have been a very wealthy man, the Nigerian culture minister said to him in Lagos. I was a very broken man, Thorn replied. Wealth wouldn't have fixed that. Between the international returns, there were the domestic ones. The ghost dance shirt was just the beginning. Sacred bundles went back to the Cheyenne, burial goods to the Pueblo peoples, ceremonial masks to Northwest Coast tribes. Each one was a reunion, each one healing. Thorn learned to sit quietly in these moments, to not make himself the center. These weren't his stories. They belonged to the communities reclaiming their heritage. But they included him anyway, made him part of the circle, because he'd been the instrument of return, even if he hadn't been the cause of theft. The trials continued. Marcus Vail was convicted and sentenced to 18 years. 3 other associates took plea deals in exchange for testimony. The network was being systematically dismantled. Museums that had unknowingly purchased pieces from Vesper's operation were cooperating, returning objects, updating their acquisition policies. The whole industry was being forced to reckon with decades of looking the other way. And Thorn testified, over and over, in federal court, in international tribunals. His story became part of the public record. The man who'd documented everything, who'd chosen evidence over enrichment. Defense attorneys tried to discredit him, brought up the Hendricks geological case, suggested he was an unreliable narrator with an axe to grind. But the evidence was too strong. The photographs, the documents, the video confession. Thorne's credibility didn't matter when the proof was overwhelming. 8 months after escaping the cabin, Thorne received a call from Agent Drummond. "We found her. Vesper. She was in Argentina using a false passport. Local police picked her up this morning. She's being extradited." Thorne felt something release in his chest, the last piece falling into place. "When?" "She'll be in federal custody within 72 hours. You'll need to testify at her trial." "I'll be ready." Vesper's trial was the biggest. She faced over 100 charges spanning 3 decades: conspiracy, trafficking, money laundering, attempted murder. Thorne sat in the witness box for 6 hours, told his story from beginning to end, every detail, every threat, every piece of evidence. Vesper sat at the defense table stone-faced. She didn't look at him, didn't react, just sat there like she was attending someone else's trial. When Thorne finished, the prosecutor asked one final question. "Mr. Caldwell, Vesper and Associates offered you $2 million to help them sell the stolen artifacts. Why did you refuse?" Thorne looked at the jury. 12 ordinary people who would decide Vesper's fate. "Because 5 years ago, I lost everything for telling the truth about environmental contamination. My career, my marriage, my reputation. All gone because I chose integrity over silence. And for 5 years, I wondered if that was the stupidest decision I'd ever made." He paused. "But when Vesper offered me that money, I realized something. I'm not the kind of person who can look at stolen sacred objects and think about profit. I'm the kind of person who thinks about the families those objects were stolen from, the communities that have been searching for them, the wounds that can't heal until they come home. So I refused the money, not because I'm noble or heroic, because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. And I've learned I can survive losing everything, but I can't survive losing myself." The courtroom was silent. Vesper was convicted on 97 of 103 counts, sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. Thorne watched the verdict with Dr. Chen, James White Eagle, and Rebecca Ortiz. "Justice," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Accountability," James added. "The end of an era," Rebecca said. "This is going to change how the art world operates. New regulations, new oversight, new consequences." Thorne didn't say anything, just felt the weight of the past year settling into something that felt like peace. That night he called Sable. They'd been talking regularly, nothing romantic, just 2 people who'd loved each other once, learning to be friends. "I saw the verdict," she said. "You did it. You actually took down the whole network. I just documented what Hendricks showed me. Stop diminishing what you did. You chose truth over $2 million. You testified in court after court. You helped return hundreds of artifacts to their rightful homes. You changed the world, Thorne. Own that." He smiled. "You sound like my therapist." "You're seeing a therapist?" "Yeah, the FBI recommended it. Trauma processing. Turns out getting hunted through a frozen forest leaves some psychological scars. I'm glad you're getting help." They talked for an hour, about the trial, about the repatriations, about what came next. "What are you going to do now?" Sable asked. "The trials are mostly over. The artifacts are being returned. What does Thorne Caldwell do for an encore?" "I don't know. I've been offered consulting jobs. Museums want help verifying provenance. Indigenous groups want assistance with repatriation claims. The State Department asked if I'd consider working on international heritage protection." "That all sounds important." "It is. But I think I need some time to just be, to not be in survival mode or testimony mode, to figure out who I am when I'm not running from something or towards something." "That sounds healthy." "Dr. Payne, my therapist, she says I've been in crisis mode for 6 years. First the Hendricks case, then the divorce, then poverty, then the vault. I've never had space to process any of it." So what does processing look like? She wants me to try something stable and quiet for a while. Maybe go back to school. Maybe teach. Something that lets me rebuild myself instead of just surviving. They talked about possibilities, about healing, about second chances. Thorn, Sable said before they hung up. I'm sorry I gave up on us, on you. I should have been stronger. We were both drowning. You did what you needed to survive. But you didn't give up. You kept choosing integrity even when it kept costing you everything. It stopped costing me, eventually. It started giving back. A year after Thorn Caldwell bought what he thought was a simple estate assessment job, he stood in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History at the opening of a new exhibition. Reclaimed, the Hendricks Collection and the Path Home, 328 artifacts, all documented, all with their stories told, where they came from, who they belonged to, how they were stolen, how they were returned. And in the center of the exhibition, a small display about the person who'd made it possible, photographs of Thorn in the vault, his testimony, his choice. You're famous now, Dr. Chen said, standing beside him. I'm documented, Thorn corrected. There's a difference. They walked through the exhibition together. Each artifact had a placard explaining not just what it was, but who it was going home to. Some had already been returned and were on loan back to the museum. Others were in the process of repatriation. The Ghost Dance shirt was there, on loan from Rosebud. Grace Tall Bear had come to DC for the opening. She stood in front of it with tears running down her face. 4 generations, she said when Thorn approached. 4 generations of my family searched for this, and it's home, because you made it home. You just chose the harder path, and that made all the difference. The exhibition opening was packed. Media, scholars, tribal representatives, government officials, all there to witness what was being called the most significant repatriation case in history. But Thorn spent most of the night talking to regular people, families who'd come to see pieces of their heritage, students studying archaeology and museum ethics, children who asked questions about the artifacts and the stories behind them. One little girl, maybe 8, asked him, "Why did the bad people take these things?" "Because they thought owning beautiful things made them important," Thorn said. "But they didn't own them. They stole them." "You're right. They stole them. And that was wrong. So you gave them back." "I helped them find their way home." The girl thought about that. "Like when I lost my teddy bear and the neighbor found it and gave it back." Exactly like that. Except these weren't teddy bears. They were pieces of people's history and culture. "Oh," the girl said seriously, "that's even more important than teddy bears." It is. Watching her walk away with her parents, Thorn felt something click into place. This was the point. Not the trials or the media coverage or being called a hero. The point was that little girl understanding that returning stolen things was important, that integrity mattered, that people could choose to do the right thing even when it was hard. Later that night, Thorn stood alone in the exhibition after everyone had left. The lights were dimmed. The artifacts sat in their cases, waiting for their journeys home. He thought about the path that had brought him here, the eviction notice, the desperate email, the frozen cabin, the vault, the choice. Always the choice. He'd made the same choice twice now, 5 years apart. Both times it had cost him. Both times he'd survived. But this time, something was different. This time, the world had rewarded integrity instead of punishing it. Not with money, although consulting fees were paying his bills comfortably now, but with purpose, with meaning, with the knowledge that he'd helped heal wounds he didn't cause. His phone buzzed, a text from Sable. "Saw the exhibition coverage. You look good. Happy. Proud of you." He texted back. "Coffee next week? I'll be back in Montana." "I'd like that." Thorn pocketed his phone and took one last look around the exhibition. Tomorrow he was flying to New Mexico to help a Pueblo community document their repatriation claim. Next month, testifying in another trial. The month after, teaching a workshop on provenance verification at a museum studies conference. His calendar was full, his purpose clear, his conscience clean. He thought about Hendricks, the man who'd destroyed his life and then engineered its redemption. It was complicated. Hendricks had been a thief, a criminal, someone who'd caused immeasurable harm. But he'd also, in the end, tried to make it right, tried to use his death to accomplish what his life couldn't. Thorne didn't forgive him. Wasn't sure forgiveness was his to give, but he understood him. Understood the weight of guilt, the desire for redemption, the hope that maybe, just maybe, one good act could balance against years of bad ones. The difference was, Hendricks had needed someone else to have the courage he lacked. Thorne had found that courage in himself, twice, and survived it both times. 6 months later, Thorne stood in a small classroom at the University of Montana. He was teaching now, part-time. Introduction to Geological Ethics, small class, 20 students. They were discussing a case study, a mining company that wanted to build on land with archaeological significance. What should the surveyor do? Hands shot up. Debate erupted. Some students argued for economic development, others for preservation. They were passionate, engaged, thinking critically about the intersection of science, ethics, and profit. This was what Thorne loved. Not the media attention or the trial testimonies. This. Shaping the next generation of scientists to think about more than just data. To consider context, impact, consequence. After class, a student approached. Young woman, maybe 22. Professor Caldwell, I have a question about the Hendricks case. Okay. You turned down $2 million. Do you ever regret it? Thorne considered. It was a question people asked often, usually phrased more carefully, but the directness was refreshing. No, he said simply, not even a little. That's life-changing money. It would have changed my bank account, but it would have destroyed my life. I would have spent every day knowing I'd chosen money over doing what was right, that I'd helped steal heritage from communities that had already lost so much. I couldn't live with that. But you lost everything the first time you chose integrity. Why choose it again? Thorne smiled. Because I learned something important. You can survive losing everything. Your job, your marriage, your reputation. All of it can go away and you can still rebuild. But you can't survive losing yourself. Can't survive becoming someone you can't respect. The student nodded slowly. So integrity isn't about the big moments. It's about who you are when no one's watching. It's about who you are when everyone's watching and offering you every reason to compromise. When the easy path is right there and all you have to do is take it. That's when you find out what you're really made of. She thanked him and left. Thorne packed up his materials, thinking about that conversation. He'd rebuilt his life. Not to where it was before, but to something better. Something rooted in purpose instead of just survival. He had work that mattered, students who challenged him, communities that trusted him. And slowly, carefully, he was rebuilding relationships he'd thought were lost forever. Last week, he'd had dinner with Sable. Just dinner. Nothing romantic. But they'd laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years, talked about the past without anger, about the future without fear. I'm seeing someone, she'd told him. A lawyer. He's kind, stable. I'm happy for you, Thorne had said. And meant it. Are you seeing anyone? Not really. I'm still figuring out who I am. Seems unfair to ask someone else to figure it out with me. That's very mature. I have a good therapist. They'd both smiled at that. Walking to his car after class, Thorne's phone rang. Dr. Chen. Thorne, I have news. The International Council of Museums is creating a new position, Director of Repatriation Ethics. They want someone with field experience, academic credentials, and a proven track record of integrity. They want you. I'm not qualified for that. I'm not a museum professional. You're the person who facilitated the largest repatriation case in history. You're more qualified than anyone. The position comes with a real salary, benefits, the chance to shape international policy on stolen cultural heritage. Thorne leaned against his car. A year ago, he'd been fixing leaky faucets and dodging eviction notices. Now he was being offered a position that could change how the entire world handled stolen artifacts. Can I think about it? Of course, but Thorne, you've earned this. You've earned something stable and important. Don't let imposter syndrome talk you out of it. That night, Thorne drove up to the mountains, to a place he'd loved before everything fell apart, an overlook where you could see the whole valley spread out below. He sat on the hood of his car, the same beaten Suburban that had carried him through the worst years, and watched the sun set over the peaks. Thought about the journey, from the desperate man who'd answered an email promising $15,000 to the person being offered a position shaping international heritage policy. Thought about the choices, the hard ones, the ones that had cost him everything and given back more. Thought about the Lakota grandmother who'd told him maybe the prophecy was true, maybe the old ways were returning, maybe healing was possible. And he realized she was right. Not just for her community, for him too. He'd been broken 5 years ago, shattered by a system that punished truth-tellers, and he'd spent those years thinking he was just surviving the wreckage. But he hadn't just survived. He'd transformed, become someone stronger, clearer, more certain of who he was and what he stood for. The first time he'd chosen integrity, it had destroyed his life. The second time, it had rebuilt it. Thorne pulled out his phone and called Dr. Chen. I'll take the position. Anyone can choose integrity when the cost is low. The real test comes when choosing right means losing everything, when doing good means accepting loss, and when standing firm means standing alone. Thorne Caldwell faced that test twice, and twice he chose the harder path. Not because he was fearless, but because he understood something profound. You can rebuild a career, repair a reputation, and recover from financial ruin, but you cannot recover from betraying your own conscience. The artifacts he helped return were priceless, but the example he set was invaluable. As the sun dipped below the Montana peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thorne Caldwell sat with the peace that only comes from knowing you did the right thing. Not for recognition or reward, but because when the moment arrived and the choice was laid bare, you were exactly who you hoped you'd be. And sometimes that's worth more than $300 million. Sometimes that's worth everything. Because in the end, the richest people aren't those who own the most. They're the ones who can look themselves in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. Thorne Caldwell had lost that person once and spent 5 years searching. He found himself again in a frozen forest, in a vault full of stolen history, in the moment he chose healing over wealth. He found himself in the courage to tell the truth when silence would have been easier, in the strength to document injustice when looking away would have been safer, in the integrity to return what was stolen when keeping it would have been more profitable. And in finding himself, he helped countless others find pieces of themselves that had been missing for generations. That's the real legacy, not the trials won or the criminals convicted, not the exhibitions or the recognition, but the ghost dance shirt that went home, the sacred objects that returned to their rightful keepers, the wounds that began to heal because one man chose truth over comfort. Thorne Caldwell started as a broke mechanic with nothing to lose. He ended as something else entirely, a reminder that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices. That integrity still matters in a world that often rewards compromise, that one person's courage can ripple across continents and through generations. The cabin in the frozen forest is empty now. Federal property, the vault sealed, the artifacts scattered to their rightful homes across the world. But the story lives on, in museum exhibitions, in courtroom transcripts, in the hearts of communities who got their heritage back, and in the life of one man who learned that being destroyed doesn't mean staying broken, that rock bottom is solid ground, and that sometimes the things that break us are exactly what we need to become who we were always meant to be. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering truth, courage, and the kind of choices that change everything. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe integrity still matters in a world that tries to price everything.